It was the first Friday evening of October, the crisp fall air wrapping around the tall, pine trees surrounding the pristine shores of Lake Tahoe, California. The sun had just begun to dip behind the distant mountains, casting a golden hue over the glistening water. The quiet of the lake was a stark contrast to the laughter and chatter spilling from the spacious, rustic vacation home that had been rented for the annual Harris family reunion. The large deck, lined with cozy chairs and a fire pit, overlooked the lake, a perfect spot for reconnecting. For Sophia Harris, the weekend had arrived at just the right time. Sophia, a woman in her early 30s, had been working relentlessly in her high-powered job in marketing, her life a whirlwind of meetings and deadlines. As a devoted wife to James, she longed for a break, a chance to relax and, perhaps, rekindle the connection with her husband that had begun to fray in recent months. The smile on her face as she greeted her family members masked the growing unease she felt deep inside. Things hadn't been the same between her and James for a while now, and she had begun to wonder if their relationship was slipping through her fingers. James, her husband of 5 years, was the picture of charm and success. A senior executive at a prestigious financial firm, his sharp suits and confident demeanor had always commanded attention. But these past few months, his gaze had become distant, his mind elsewhere. When he wasn't staring at his phone, he was lost in thought, and when they did speak, his responses seemed more absent than engaged. Sophia, ever the optimist, had hoped that this reunion would offer them a chance to reconnect, to bring back the closeness they once shared. Sophia's attention shifted as she observed her husband from across the room. James was talking animatedly with Clara Mitchell, his colleague from work, and now, it seemed, a guest at the reunion. Clara, a woman in her early 40s, was everything Sophia admired, confident, ambitious, and effortlessly graceful. The two had worked together for years, and while their professional relationship had always been strictly business, Sophia couldn't help but admire Clara's presence. Clara had always been a mentor to her, offering advice on career growth, and their occasional chats had strengthened their bond. But now, watching them interact, something felt off. As the evening wore on, the subtle tension began to creep in. The warmth of the fire pit couldn't chase away the coldness that had begun to settle in Sophia's chest. Clara's laughter rang out a little too loudly at James' jokes, and their conversation seemed to stretch longer than those with anyone else. Sophia, doing her best to ignore the growing knot in her stomach, moved around the deck, checking on the food and drinks, all the while trying to shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. James and Clara lingered by the railing, their heads leaning close as they exchanged words. Sophia's eyes flicked between the two of them, the way Clara seemed to be hanging on every word that James spoke. Their proximity, the way Clara's hand brushed his arm as she laughed, small gestures, yet they felt heavy, too intimate. Sophia's heartbeat quickened, and she tried to swallow the rising sense of jealousy and insecurity. "It's just the weekend," she told herself. "It's nothing." But as the night continued, the unease only deepened. Every interaction between Clara and James seemed to reinforce the feeling that Sophia couldn't shake, that the two of them shared something far beyond friendship. Clara leaned in a little too close when she spoke to James, her fingers brushing his arm a little too often. A strange sense of unease bubbled up in Sophia's chest. She told herself that she was imagining things, that she was overthinking. Clara was just being friendly, and James, well, James had always been the life of the party. Still, she couldn't ignore the voice in her head telling her to pay attention. As the evening grew late and the guests gathered around the fire pit, Sophia sat back, observing the interactions between James and Clara. Their easy chemistry was undeniable. It wasn't just the playful jokes or shared laughter, it was the glances, the subtle touches, the way they leaned into each other's personal space. Sophia felt like an outsider in her own marriage, and the more she watched, the more the small nagging voice in her head turned into a deafening scream. "Am I just jealous?" She wondered, but deep down, she knew it wasn't just that. Something was wrong. She couldn't explain it, but the feeling grew with each passing minute. Later, as the group gathered inside the house, the laughter from the deck echoed faintly behind them. Sophia tried to shake off the uneasy sensation in her gut, making small talk with her relatives and trying to focus on the warmth of the reunion. But in the back of her mind, all she could think about was the subtle connection she had witnessed between James and Clara. She wanted to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't there, but the unease refused to let go. And in the quiet of the night, far from the laughter of the others, the truth, whatever it was, began to simmer, waiting to surface. Sophia stepped away from the crowd, her eyes seeking James and Clara once more, but this time, her heart was heavy with the sinking feeling that she was about to learn something she might never be able to forget. The night lingered on, the sounds of clinking glasses and laughter from the fire pit mingling with the cool, crisp breeze that swept across Lake Tahoe. The flickering flames from the fire cast shadows on the wooden deck, their warmth offering a stark contrast to the growing chill inside Sophia. She found herself moving from one group to another, offering a polite smile here, a laugh there, all the while her mind racing back to James and Clara. Her eyes kept flicking toward them, drawn like a magnet to their interactions, as though the attraction was impossible to ignore. Sophia tried to focus on the moment, but the more she observed James and Clara, the more her discomfort grew. They were seated now, a little off to the side, their heads leaning close together, laughing over a shared joke. Sophia's chest tightened. The closeness between them felt too intimate, too natural. James had always been charismatic, the life of the party, but there was something about the way Clara responded to him that felt different, more than just admiration. The air around her seemed to thicken as she tried to shake off her unease. "Stop overthinking," she told herself. "It's just a friendly conversation. They're having fun. This is supposed to be a relaxing weekend." But as the night wore on, those quiet moments continued to catch Sophia's attention. She noticed how Clara's hand would brush against James' arm when they spoke, her fingers lingering a little too long. When James leaned back, looking out over the lake, Clara would sometimes touch his shoulder, a soft, affectionate gesture that no longer seemed so innocent. Sophia's mind raced to make sense of it. Maybe I'm being paranoid. Maybe I'm just imagining things because I'm tired and stressed. But there it was again, a familiar flutter of discomfort, as if an invisible thread was pulling Sophia's gaze toward the two of them. She couldn't look away. The next morning, as the sun rose over the lake, the air was still crisp, but the day seemed to be filled with an overwhelming sense of anticipation. Family members slowly trickled out onto the deck, gathered around the breakfast spread. Yet, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the morning unfolded, her attention kept drifting back to James and Clara, who had once again found themselves in deep conversation, this time out of earshot from the others. Clara's laugh was louder than usual, a little too emphatic for a joke that, to Sophia, seemed less than funny. Sophia's heart began to race. She caught herself staring at them, and when Clara glanced in her direction, Sophia quickly looked away, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I shouldn't care," she told herself. "They're just friends. Nothing is happening. Nothing has happened." But deep inside, the discomfort refused to fade. At one point, Sophia moved toward the lake's edge to get some fresh air, trying to clear her mind. The peaceful serenity of the water did little to calm her nerves. She paced the shoreline, her thoughts spiraling. "I'm being irrational. This is just a family gathering, nothing more," she repeated over and over. But then, as she turned back toward the house, she saw them again, James and Clara, standing close together, their faces almost touching as they spoke in hushed tones, their voices low and intimate. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. The way they looked at each other, the way Clara's fingers brushed against James' hand. She couldn't deny it any longer. There was something between them, something undeniable, and it wasn't just friendly banter. She felt the ground shift beneath her feet, and for a moment, it was as if the world around her blurred. She was trapped in her own head, the weight of her suspicions pressing down on her chest. How could I not have seen it? She wondered. How long has this been going on? The afternoon passed in a blur. Sophia tried to remain focused on the family, participating in the activities around the house, but every time she glanced toward James and Clara, the same tightness gripped her chest. The quiet moments between them, moments that had once seemed innocent, now felt charged with something darker. Her eyes would catch their shared glances, the way they would both smile and laugh at private jokes, as if they had their own world that she was not a part of. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, the family gathered on the deck once more. The fire was lit again, and the warmth of the flames flickered in contrast to the coolness Sophia felt. She sat with her back to the fire, eyes following James and Clara, whose interaction had only deepened over the course of the weekend. She tried to focus on the conversation with her relatives, but every now and then, her attention would drift to them. She caught Clara placing a hand on James' arm again, this time as they both leaned in to share a secret laugh. There it was again, the connection. It was undeniable. The knot in Sophia's stomach tightened. A sense of betrayal gnawed at her, a feeling that her heart refused to let go of. Her fingers clenched around the glass in her hand, her nails digging into the cool surface. It's just in my head, she thought, trying to convince herself. But deep down, she knew. She knew she wasn't imagining it. As the night wore on, Sophia found herself retreating into the shadows of the house, stepping away from the growing tension that hung over her. The laughter of the others seemed distant, hollow, as if she were in a different world entirely. She couldn't focus on the conversations, couldn't enjoy the warmth of the fire or the company of her family. All she could hear in her mind was the image of James and Clara, standing so close, sharing their private moments, laughing like they were more than just colleagues. Sophia stood by the window, watching them in silence. The voices in her head grew louder. I can't ignore this any longer. The truth was staring her in the face. They weren't just friends. Something deeper, darker, was unfolding right before her eyes. And she couldn't pretend she didn't see it anymore. Her heart raced, a storm of emotions rising within her. She needed answers. She needed to know what was really happening between James and Clara. The calm facade she had tried to maintain was crumbling. There was no going back now. The night had settled in deeper, the laughter from the deck now quieted to a faint hum as the stars above the lake shimmered coldly. Sophia stood at the far edge of the house, gazing out into the distance, the cool wind brushing against her skin, but it did little to quell the fire burning inside her. She had tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that her growing suspicions were just the product of exhaustion and insecurity. But now, in the stillness of the night, the truth seemed inevitable, lurking like a shadow that refused to leave. Sophia couldn't stop watching them, James and Clara. Their closeness had become undeniable. Every laugh they shared felt like a dagger to her chest. It wasn't just innocent conversation, there was an intimacy there that she could no longer pretend not to see. The touch of Clara's hand on James' arm, the way their heads would lean together when they spoke, those little moments of connection, so subtle yet so telling. But even with all the evidence in front of her, she hesitated. What if she was wrong? What if she was imagining things? The possibility of confronting her husband about something that might not even be true gnawed at her. But she knew deep down, with a certainty that made her stomach churn, that something was happening. And she couldn't continue pretending otherwise. As the evening wore on, the rest of the family continued to enjoy the fire pit, lost in their own conversations. Sophia made her way to the kitchen, her mind racing. She needed space, needed to clear her head, but as she passed the living room, a sound stopped her. The soft murmur of voices. Familiar voices. Curiosity tugged at her, and without thinking, she took a few steps closer to the hallway that led to the back of the house. The voices were faint but distinct. She could hear Clara's laughter, a sound that had once been comforting and familiar to Sophia, now piercing her like a knife. Her heart skipped as she crept closer, trying to make out the words. And then she heard it. "I love the way it feels when we're together," Clara's voice whispered, almost too soft to hear. "It's thrilling, the secret of it. Like no one knows, like we can just be ourselves." Sophia froze, her heart stopping in her chest. She couldn't breathe, her mind spinning as the words echoed in her ears. She knew what she was hearing, but she couldn't bring herself to believe it. She wanted to turn and run, to pretend that she hadn't overheard anything. But her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot. James responded in a low, almost breathless voice. "It's dangerous, isn't it? But I can't stop. It feels too good, being with you. The secrecy, the thrill, it's everything I've wanted." Sophia's stomach churned violently, the bile rising in her throat. She didn't need to hear more. She didn't need to confirm it any further. The truth was laid bare in those few words, a painful admission of what she had suspected all along. Her husband, her James, was having an affair with Clara. Her knees nearly buckled beneath her as she leaned against the wall for support. Her vision blurred as a wave of nausea hit her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The world around her seemed to tilt, and all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart, deafening in the silence. But then, as if on cue, a burst of laughter from James rang out, a sound that had always been familiar, always been comforting. But now, it felt like a slap in the face. How could he laugh so easily? How could he sound so carefree when everything she had believed in, the life they had built together, was shattering before her eyes? A sharp pang of rage and heartbreak surged through her chest. She wanted to storm into the room, to confront them both, to scream at them for the betrayal they had so carelessly inflicted on her. But she couldn't move. She couldn't find her voice. Instead, she pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob that threatened to break free. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity before she heard Clara speak again, her voice thick with affection. "I can't wait to see you again, James. We'll find a way. We always do." Sophia felt a wave of icy cold wash over her, the shock of the revelation numbing her body. She staggered back, retreating into the shadows, needing to get away, needing to escape the suffocating pain that threatened to consume her. She stumbled blindly down the hall, her heart hammering in her chest. The house felt too small now, too suffocating, as though it were closing in on her. She didn't know how long she had been standing there, listening, before she managed to tear herself away. Her legs were unsteady as she made her way back to her room, her mind a whirlwind of rage, disbelief, and utter devastation. Her marriage, her entire world, had just crumbled in a matter of moments. Closing the door behind her, she slumped against it, her back pressed firmly against the wood. Her body trembled violently as she sank to the floor, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She couldn't understand how this had happened. How could James, the man she loved, the man she trusted, betray her like this? And Clara, her trusted mentor, her colleague, had been the one to help destroy everything. She felt the weight of the betrayal pressing down on her chest, suffocating her, as the tears began to fall. For a long time, she just sat there, trying to make sense of the chaos inside her. Her heart was torn between anger, grief, and disbelief. She had loved James with every fiber of her being, had built a life with him, only to discover that it had all been a lie. In the silence of her room, Sophia made a vow to herself. She wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. The pain and humiliation that coursed through her would not go unanswered. She would make them pay. But for now, all she could do was sit in the darkness, the weight of the truth crushing her, as she wrestled with the enormity of what had just been revealed. The hours that followed Sophia's discovery passed in a haze, a blur of overwhelming emotions she couldn't escape. She sat alone in the quiet of her room, the darkness surrounding her like a heavy blanket, smothering her. Her heart pounded erratically in her chest as she replayed the conversation between James and Clara over and over in her mind. Each word, each laugh, echoed in her ears, reverberating painfully as the realization took root. Her world had been shattered. The life she had carefully built with James now lay in ruins, a hollow echo of what it once was. She could still feel the cold rush of shock when she had first overheard their words. The chill had cut through her, yet the fire of rage that followed burned even hotter. How could they? She thought, clenching her fists at her sides. How could he do this to me? How could Clara, of all people, betray my trust like this? The betrayal felt like a cruel, jagged wound in her chest, the pain coursing through her body like wildfire. Sophia pulled her knees up to her chest, burying her face in her hands. The tears she had tried to hold back now flowed freely, each drop a reminder of her vulnerability, of how easily her heart had been torn apart. She thought of the years she had spent with James, the promises they had made to each other, the life they had planned. All of it had been a lie, and the weight of that truth crushed her. But it wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the why of it all. Why had James, the man she had loved and trusted so deeply, turned to someone else? Why had Clara, her mentor, her friend, been the one to cross the line? The questions whirled in her mind like a storm, each one unanswered, leaving her more confused and desperate for clarity. Sophia's mind was at war with itself. Part of her wanted to confront James immediately, to scream at him, to demand answers. She wanted to tear into Clara, to expose her for what she was, an opportunist who had taken everything from Sophia without a second thought. But another part of her was frozen in place, paralyzed by the enormity of the situation. What would happen if she confronted them now? Would it make things better, or would it destroy what little was left of their relationship? Was there anything left to salvage, or had it already been irreparably broken? Why didn't I see it sooner? She wondered, her thoughts turning inwards. How could I have been so blind? Sophia had always prided herself on being strong, on seeing through lies and deception. But in this moment, she felt small, powerless, as if the very foundation of her life had crumbled beneath her. She couldn't escape the sense of failure that weighed heavily on her shoulders, the crushing guilt that perhaps she had missed the signs. Maybe if she had paid closer attention, if she hadn't been so focused on her own career, she could have seen what was happening. But there was no time for regret. Sophia's emotions were a swirl of anger and sadness, each one fighting for dominance. She wanted revenge, she needed it. How could she just sit back and let James and Clara continue their lives, free of consequence, when they had taken so much from her? The anger inside her burned bright, filling her with a cold, bitter resolve. She couldn't just be the victim in this story. She wouldn't let them walk away unscathed. And yet, as the rage bubbled up, another feeling emerged, something darker and more insidious, doubt. Was this the right course of action? Could she really do this? The thought of confronting James and Clara made her stomach twist. What would that conversation even look like? Could she live with herself afterward, knowing she had unleashed something so destructive? Sophia closed her eyes, trying to silence the conflicting emotions that swirled in her mind. The anger was powerful, almost intoxicating, but it felt like a double-edged sword. In seeking revenge, she would be lowering herself to their level, becoming something she had always despised, a woman consumed by her own bitterness and rage. But in doing nothing, she would be complicit in her own suffering, a silent participant in a betrayal she didn't deserve. The silence in the room was suffocating. Sophia's thoughts raced as she tried to calm the storm inside her. She remembered the person she had been before all of this, the strong, independent woman who had built her career and her life alongside James. Could she still be that person? Or had the betrayal irreparably changed her, twisting her into someone darker, someone she didn't recognize? Her thoughts turned to James. The man she had loved for so long, the man who had stood by her through thick and thin. How could he betray her so easily? How could he stand there, pretending everything was normal, when in reality, he was living a lie? The idea of confronting him filled her with dread, but at the same time, she knew she couldn't keep carrying this pain, this rage, inside her. She needed answers. She needed closure. Sophia stood up, pacing the room as she wrestled with herself. Every fiber of her being screamed to take action, to confront James and Clara, to make them feel the weight of her hurt. But another part of her, a small, rational voice, reminded her of the consequences. What if exposing them ruined everything? What if it was too late to fix anything, even if she did find the answers she sought? The truth was out there, but was she ready to face it? The conflict within Sophia was unbearable, a constant tug-of-war between the woman who longed for justice and the woman who feared what would happen if she took that final step. As the minutes ticked by, she found herself standing at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take, but knowing that whatever decision she made next, there would be no turning back. The morning after Sophia's discovery was a blur, her mind clouded by the storm of emotions raging within her. She barely noticed the others gathering on the deck, their voices floating on the crisp autumn air as they enjoyed breakfast. The light from the rising sun, so full of promise and warmth, seemed alien to her now. All she could feel was the cold. A coldness that had settled deep in her bones ever since she overheard James and Clara, a coldness that refused to let go. Sophia had spent the night in turmoil, barely sleeping, her mind replaying their whispered words, their laughter, over and over. Each repetition only deepened the wound, and the anger inside her grew, becoming something she could no longer contain. She had promised herself that she wouldn't just be the victim, that she wouldn't let them get away with this. But she had also known, on some level, that once she acted, there would be no going back. She had spent hours considering her options, pacing back and forth, trying to quiet the voices in her head. What should she do? How could she make them feel the pain she felt? How could she make James and Clara see the destruction they had caused? But the more she thought about it, the clearer her path became. She would expose them. She would make them feel what she had felt, the humiliation, the betrayal, the crushing weight of a broken heart. Sophia knew she had to confront them. The more she sat with her anger, the more it consumed her, turning from a flicker into an uncontrollable blaze. She couldn't pretend anymore that everything was okay. So, with that resolve hardening inside her, she decided to take action. It was late afternoon when the moment arrived. The day had been slow, stretching endlessly with the weight of her thoughts. Most of the family had gone out for a hike, leaving the house quiet, almost too quiet. Sophia had been waiting for this, waiting for the chance when she would have them both alone, when she could confront them and finally tear down the facade they had so easily put up in front of her. Her heart raced as she made her way to the back of the house. Her hands were shaking, but she ignored it. She couldn't back down now. The air outside was cool and still, the sun beginning to dip beneath the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. It felt like the calm before the storm. James and Clara were standing near the lake, just out of earshot of the house. Their laughter drifted on the breeze, too casual, too familiar, as if nothing had changed. As if everything was still the same. Sophia's footsteps were barely a whisper on the grass as she approached them, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, rehearsing the words she would say, but now, as the time had come, the words stuck in her throat. For a moment, she hesitated. Was she ready for this? Could she really do it? But as she watched them, so close, so comfortable in each other's presence, the anger returned, sharper this time. It didn't matter anymore. She had to know the truth. She had to make them see. She stepped forward, her voice suddenly loud in the quiet of the evening. James. Clara, she called, her voice trembling but firm. Both of them froze, turning slowly to face her, surprise flickering in their eyes. Clara's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly masked it, her gaze sliding to James before meeting Sophia's. James, too, looked taken aback, his face pale under the setting sun, his hand subconsciously reaching for his phone, almost as if he wanted to escape. But there was no escape now. Sophia stood there, her chest heaving as she fought to keep her composure. She could feel the weight of her own fury pressing down on her. Her heart raced, each beat pounding like a drum in her ears, but she forced herself to look them both in the eye. "I know," she said, her voice steady now, though every word was laced with a raw intensity. "I know about you too. The affair. The lies. Everything." The silence between them stretched on for what felt like forever. Clara's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words, but nothing came out. James, on the other hand, stood frozen, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Sophia thought she saw something in his eyes, something that resembled guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He cleared his throat and finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Sophia, I can explain." "Explain?" Sophia's voice cracked with a bitter laugh. "How do you explain this, James? How do you explain what you've done? The lies you've told, the trust you've destroyed?" She stepped closer, her anger flaring again, but this time, it wasn't just anger, it was something darker, something she didn't recognize. It felt like a flame consuming her, burning away everything she had once believed. Her world, her marriage, had just been turned upside down. And she wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. "Is this how it is now, James?" she continued, her voice sharp. "You get to keep the life I thought we had, and I'm supposed to just pretend everything's fine? You think you can do this to me, to us, and walk away without facing the consequences?" Clara stepped forward, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Sophia, please, No," Sophia cut her off, her voice rising. "No, I've had enough. You think you can just waltz into my life and take everything from me? No one betrays me like this. Not without paying the price." Clara's eyes widened, a mixture of guilt and fear flashing across her face. She tried to speak, but no words came. James took a step back, his face pale. "Sophia, please." But before he could finish, the anger inside Sophia exploded. Without thinking, she took a step forward, her hand raised, and in a flash, she shoved James hard in the chest. The force of it sent him stumbling back, and he caught himself just before he fell into the lake. The sound of his shocked gasp echoed in the evening air, but it was drowned out by the rush of Sophia's emotions. The confrontation had spiraled out of her control. Clara reached for James, her hands grabbing his arm to steady him, but in doing so, she lost her balance. With a scream, she slipped and fell backward into the lake. Sophia stood there, breathless, staring at the lake where James and Clara had just been. The silence that followed was deafening. Neither of them surfaced. Sophia's chest tightened as reality hit her with full force. She had never meant for this to happen. But it had. The weight of what she had done came crashing down on her like a ton of bricks. Her pulse thundered in her ears. What had she done? The lake was eerily still. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the pounding of Sophia's heartbeat, thudding in her ears like a drum. She stood frozen at the edge of the lake, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling, but she couldn't look away from the spot where James and Clara had fallen. The water, once so peaceful and inviting, now seemed to mock her, reflecting the chaos inside her heart. For a moment, Sophia felt nothing. No sorrow, no remorse, just a deep, hollow emptiness, as if all the life had drained out of her in an instant. Her mind raced, but there were no coherent thoughts, just flashes of images, Clara's hand brushing against James, their laughter, their intimate proximity, and then her own fury, her hands shoving him away, the shock on his face, the way Clara had slipped, and the way neither of them had resurfaced. It was as if the world had paused, the gravity of the situation suspended in the air, refusing to let her breathe. What have I done? The thought echoed, but it didn't bring comfort. It didn't bring clarity. She couldn't undo the violence she had unleashed, the way she had acted out of pure rage, letting it guide her to a place she never thought she'd go. She didn't want to hurt anyone, at least, she hadn't meant to, but in that moment, the pain had been too much, and the overwhelming need for retribution had clouded her judgment. The anger had taken over. She stumbled back, feeling her knees weaken as the shock of what had just happened hit her with full force. She hadn't intended for this to escalate the way it had, but now, it was too late. Both James and Clara were in the water, and neither had come up. Sophia's breath quickened as panic set in. What if they didn't come back? What if they were gone? Sophia's hands shook violently as she fumbled for her phone, her thoughts scattered, racing with fear and disbelief. She called 911, her voice trembling as she gave the details, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew deep down that nothing could reverse what she had done. There was no going back now. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Sophia stood by the lake, her body trembling uncontrollably, her mind spiraling in every direction. She had destroyed everything in one rash moment. The life she thought she knew, the marriage she had built with James, the trust she had placed in Clara, it was all gone. When the authorities arrived, the cold, clinical reality of the situation settled in. The officers did their best to maintain control, but it was clear to Sophia, nothing could fix what had happened. She was the one who had crossed the line. She was the one who had let anger consume her. And it wasn't just the physical consequences. The emotional wreckage was far more profound. In trying to exact revenge on the two people who had hurt her, Sophia had lost herself. She had let her fury define her, become a part of her, and in doing so, had left behind the woman she once was, strong, compassionate, in control. That woman had vanished in the heat of the moment, replaced by someone who was driven not by justice, but by a primal, vengeful desire to make them feel the pain she had felt. Sophia sat down on the cold, damp ground, her back against a tree, her head bowed in defeat. The sounds of the officers and paramedics faded as she was consumed by her own thoughts. The lessons she had been taught, the ones that she had always believed in, about forgiveness, about empathy, about taking control of her emotions, seemed so distant now. She had broken every one of them. And for what? She had expected to feel empowered, to feel like she had regained control of her life. Instead, she was left with a crushing emptiness, an overwhelming guilt that consumed her every thought. She had become everything she had feared, the person she despised, someone who let pain drive them to extremes. The thirst for revenge had twisted her into a stranger, and now she was staring at the wreckage of her own choices. As the authorities continued their work, Sophia found herself looking at the shimmering surface of the lake, feeling the weight of every decision that had brought her to this point. The water, calm and still, seemed to mock her as the world around her spun out of control. The human lesson became painfully clear. Revenge was not the answer, it never had been. In her desire to make James and Clara pay for what they had done, she had only deepened her own suffering. She had lost herself in her anger, and in the process, had lost everything that truly mattered. Sophia knew she would have to live with the consequences of her actions, whatever they may be. There was no erasing what had happened. She could not undo the devastation she had caused. But somewhere deep inside, she knew that the journey ahead wouldn't just be about dealing with the aftermath of the confrontation, it would be about trying to rebuild herself. To find the woman she had once been, to find the strength to forgive herself, and to learn the hardest lesson of all, that in the pursuit of vengeance, one often sacrifices everything they hold dear. She closed her eyes, the tears that had been threatening to spill finally breaking free. It wasn't just for James and Clara anymore. It was for the person she used to be, the person she had let slip away. The woman who had loved, who had trusted, who had believed in the power of forgiveness. Sophia had to let go of the anger. But could she? Could she ever find her way back from the depths of the wreckage she had created? Only time would tell. But for now, all she could do was sit there in the stillness, watching the ripples on the water, and try to come to terms with the choices that had irrevocably changed her life. The days following the confrontation were a blur for Sophia. The phone calls, the questioning from the authorities, the whispers and stares from her family, everything felt like a distant, muffled echo. The lake, once so peaceful and inviting, now felt like a symbol of the wreckage she had caused. Her world had fractured into pieces, each shard representing a different part of the life she had built and destroyed in one reckless, furious moment. Sophia hadn't seen James or Clara since that day. The police had conducted their investigations, but the damage was already done. She hadn't expected them to reappear, but still, in the silence of her home, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been irreparably lost. The house that had once felt like a safe haven now seemed foreign to her. She didn't recognize the woman who had become so consumed by anger. She didn't recognize herself. It was late one evening, the sky dark and heavy with the weight of another storm, when Sophia found herself standing at the edge of Lake Tahoe, staring out at the now turbulent waters. The storm mirrored the storm inside her, an emotional chaos she could no longer outrun. She had been to this spot many times before, but tonight, it felt different. The water churned, wild and unforgiving, just like the anger that had driven her to the edge. Sophia sat down on a large rock, her gaze fixed on the rippling surface of the lake. She was alone with her thoughts, thoughts of James, of Clara, and of everything that had brought her to this point. The pain from the betrayal still lingered, a dull ache in her chest, but it was no longer the rage that consumed her. It had faded, replaced by something more profound, more humbling. Guilt. The reality of her actions hit her harder now than ever. She had acted out of a sense of justice, thinking that if she exposed their betrayal, it would somehow make her whole again. But instead, it had only deepened her wounds. Revenge hadn't made her feel powerful or vindicated. It had broken her, broken the woman she once was. She had let her anger define her, and in doing so, had lost herself. The truth, as painful as it was, had become clear. Revenge could never heal a broken heart. All it did was create more pain. She closed her eyes, the cool breeze brushing across her face, and let herself feel everything that had built up inside her, the shame, the regret, the sorrow. In the quiet of the evening, with the storm raging on around her, Sophia realized that no amount of revenge would undo the hurt she felt. No amount of anger could erase the love she once shared with James, or the trust she had put in Clara. The bitterness that had consumed her was a poison, and the only antidote was forgiveness, not just of James or Clara, but of herself. It was time to move forward. Sophia knew that forgiveness would not come easily, nor would it come overnight. It was a long road, one that she would have to walk alone. But in that moment, as the storm began to subside, she made a vow to herself: she would rebuild her life, piece by piece. She would learn to forgive, to release the anger that had held her captive, and most importantly, to find herself again. The path ahead was unclear, and there were still many unanswered questions. What would she say to James if he ever came back? Could she ever look Clara in the eye again without feeling that sting of betrayal? But one thing was certain: Sophia had learned the hard way that vengeance was a fleeting satisfaction, a brief escape from the hurt. True healing came from letting go, from confronting the pain head-on and refusing to let it dictate her life any longer. Sophia took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs, and stood up. The clouds above began to part, letting through the first rays of sunlight after the storm. The lake, once churning with turmoil, now reflected the faint light of a new dawn. It was a new beginning, not just for the world around her, but for herself. As she walked away from the lake, Sophia didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope, a quiet strength that she hadn't felt in a long time. She had lost so much, but in facing her demons, she had found the courage to begin again. What do you think about Sophia's journey? Was her quest for revenge justified, or did it lead her down a path of destruction? Could forgiveness have been the answer all along? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Let us know in the comments below, how do you feel about the consequences of revenge, and do you think it's ever worth it? What would you have done in Sophia's situation? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this, and share this video with anyone who might need to hear this lesson today.